will you look at us by the river? The whole restless mob of us on spread blankets in the dreamy briny sunshine skylarking and chacking about for one day, one clear, clean, sweet day in a good world in the midst of our living. Yachts run before an unfelt gust with bag-necked pelicans riding above them, the city their twitching backdrop, all blocks and points of mirror light down to the water's edge. 20 years, they all say, sprawling and drinking. There's ginger beer, stagger juice, and hot flasks of tea. There are pasties, a ham, chicken legs, and a basket of oranges, potato salad, and dried figs. There are things spilling from jars and bags. The speech is silenced by a melodious belch which gets big applause. Someone blurts on a baby's belly and a song strikes up. Unless you knew, you'd think they were a whole group, an earthly vision. Because, look, even the missing are there, the gone and taken are with them in the shade pools of the peppermints by the beautiful the river. And even now, one of the here is leaving.
Jasper Jones has come to my window. I don't know why, but he has. Maybe he's in trouble. Maybe he doesn't have anywhere else to go. Either way, he's just frightened the living shit out of me. This is the hottest summer I can remember, and the thick heat seems to seep in and keep my sleep out. It's like the Earth's core in here. The only relief comes from the cooler air that creeps in between the slim slats of my single window. It's near impossible to sleep, so I've spent most of my nights reading by the light of my kerosene lamp. Tonight was no different. And when Jasper Jones rapped my louvers abruptly with his knuckle and hissed my name, I leapt from my bed, spilling my copy of Pudd'nhead Wilson. Charlie. Charlie. I knelt like a sprinter, anxious and alert. Who is it? Charlie. Come out here. Who is it? It's Jasper. What? Who? Jasper. Jasper. And he pressed his face right up into the light. His eyes green and wild. I squinted. What? Really? What is it? I need your help. Just come out here and I'll explain, he whispered. What? Why? Jesus Christ, Charlie. Just hurry up. Get out here.
Panic was my first reaction to the multiple choice options which lay on my desk in front of me. I glanced at the students around me before turning back to question 3. I hated multiple choice. Yet I didn't want to get question 3 wrong. I didn't want to get any of them wrong. The outcome would be too devastating for my sense of being. So I began with elimination. D was completely out of the question, as was A, so that left B and C. I pondered both for quite a while, and just as I was about to make my final decision I heard my name being called. Josephine? Ha? I think you mean I beg your pardon, don't you, dear? I beg your pardon, sister. What are you doing? You're reading, aren't you, young lady? Yeah. Yeah. Excellent, Josephine. I can see you walking away with the English prize this year. Now stand up. So my final school year began. I had promised myself that I would be a saint for this year alone. I would make the greatest impression on my teachers and become the model student. I knew it would all fail. But just not on the first day. Sister Gregory walked towards me, and when she was so close that I could see her mustache, she held out her hand.
Boo, hoo. Ow, ow, oh. Oh. Meal die. Boo, hoo. The pain, the pain. Boo, hoo. Come, come, now. Daddy's little mate isn't going to turn Turk like that, is she? I'll put some fat out of the dinner bag on it and tie it up in my hanky. Don't cry any more now. Hush, you must not cry. You'll make old Dart buck if you kick up a row like that. That is my first recollection of life. I was barely 3. I can remember the majestic gum trees surrounding us, the sun glinting on their straight white trunks, and falling on the gurgling fern-banked stream, which disappeared beneath a steep scrubby hill on our left. It was an hour past noon on a long clear summer day. We were on a distant part of the run, where my father had come to deposit salt. He had left home early in the dewy morning, carrying me in front of him on a little brown pillow which my mother had made for the purpose. We had put the lumps of rock salt in the troughs on the other side of the creek. The stringy bark roof of the salt shed which protected the troughs from rain peeped out picturesquely from the musk and peppercorn shrubs by which it was densely surrounded, and was visible from where we lunched. I refilled the quart pot in which we had boiled our tea with water from the creek. Father doused our fire out with it, and then tied the quart to the D of his saddle with a piece of green hide.
Everyone agreed that the day was just right for the picnic to Hanging Rock, a shimmering summer morning, warm and still, with cicadas shrilling all through breakfast from the loquat trees outside the dining room windows and bees murmuring above the pansies bordering the drive. Heavy-headed dahlias flamed and drooped in the immaculate flower beds, the well-trimmed lawns steamed under the mounting sun. Already the gardener was watering the hydrangeas still shaded by the kitchen wing at the rear of the college. The boarders at Mrs. Appleyard's College for Young Ladies had been up and scanning the bright unclouded sky since 6 o'clock and were now fluttering about in their holiday muslins like a flock of excited butterflies. Not only was it a Saturday and the long-awaited occasion of the annual picnic, but St. Valentine's Day, traditionally celebrated on the 14th of February by the interchange of elaborate cards and favors. All were madly romantic and strictly anonymous, supposedly the silent tributes of lovesick admirers, although Mr. Whitehead the elderly English gardener and Tom the Irish groom were almost the only two males to be so much as smiled at during the term. The headmistress was probably the only person at the college who received no cards. It was well known that Mrs. Appleyard disapproved of St. Valentine and his ridiculous greetings that cluttered up the college mantelpieces right up to Easter and gave as much extra dusting to the maids as the annual prize-giving. And such mantelpieces! 2 in the long drawing-room of white marble, supported by pairs of caryatids as firm of bust as Madame herself, others of carved and tortured wood embellished with 1,000 winking tittling mirrors. Appleyard College was already, in the year 1900, an architectural anachronism in the Australian bush, a hopeless misfit in time and place.
In June of 1900, Jimmie Blacksmith's maternal uncle Tibiji, Jackie Smolders to the white world, was disturbed to get news that Jimmie had married a white girl in the Methodist Church at Walla. Therefore he set out with Jimmie's initiation tooth to walk 100 miles to Walla. The tooth would be a remonstration and lay a tribal claim on Jimmie. For Tibiji, Jackie Smolders was full-blooded and of the Tullum section of the Mungindi tribe. To his mind, people should continue to wed according to the tribal pattern, which was, that Tullum should marry Mungara, Mungara should wed Gary, Gary should wed Wibra, Wibra take Tullum's women. But here was Jimmie, a Tullum, married in church to a white girl. Jackie felt distressed, a spiritual unease over Jimmie Blacksmith's wedding. These tribal arrangements should still be made, Tibiji Jackie Smolders thought. The elders kept the tribal pattern in their heads and could arrange a tribal wedding even if the Tullum buck was on a mission station 80 miles, 200 miles, from Mungara woman. Jackie Smolders was therefore dispirited, so too even his flippant sister, a full-blooded lady called Dulcie Blacksmith. Half-breed Jimmie had resulted from a visit some white man had made to Brentwood Blacks Camp in 1878. The missionaries, who had never been told the higher things of Wibra, had made it clear that if you had pale children it was because you'd been rolled by white men.
The 4 children were lying on the grass. And the prince went further and further into the forest, said the elder girl, till he came to a beautiful glade. A glade, you know, is a place in the forest that is open and green and lovely. And there he saw a lady, a beautiful lady, in a long white dress that hung down to her ankles, with a golden belt and a golden crown. She was lying on the sward. A sward, you know, is grass as smooth as velvet, just like green velvet, and the prince saw the marks of travel on her garments. The bottom of the lovely silk dress was all dirty. "Wondrous fair, if you don't mind you'll make that sheet dirty, too," said Pin. "Shut up, will you?" answered her sister, who, carried away by her narrative, had approached her boots to some linen that was bleaching. "Yes, but you know Sarah'll be awfully cross if she has to wash it again," said Pin, who was practical. "You'll put me out altogether," cried Laura angrily. "Well, as I said, the edge of her robe was all muddy." "No, I don't think I will say that, it sounds prettier if it's clean." So it hung in long, straight beautiful folds to her ankles, and the prince saw 2 little feet in golden sandals peeping out from under the hem of the silken gown, and... "But what about the marks of travel?" asked Leppy. "Donkey. Haven't I said they weren't there? If I say they weren't, then they weren't. She hadn't traveled at all."
The hills are full of Irish people. When their grandfathers and great-grandfathers arrived in Sydney, they went naturally to shanty town, not because they were dirty or lazy, though many of them were that, but because they were poor. And wherever there are poor you will find landlords who build tenements, cramming 2 on a piece of land no bigger than a pocket handkerchief, and letting them for the rent of 4. In the squalid, mazy streets of sandstone double-decker houses, each with its little balcony edged with rusty iron lace, and its door opening onto the street, or 4 square feet of front, every second name is an Irish one. There are Brodys, and Caseys and Murphys and O'Briens, and down by the corner are Casement and Grogan and Kell, and, although here and there you find a Simich, or a Siciliano, or a Jewish shopkeeper, or a Chinese laundryman, most are Irish. Even the names of the streets tell the story of those old emigrants who came looking for roads cobbled with gold, and found them made of stone harder than an overseer's heart. There is Fahey Street running off Riley Street, and both of them branching from Coronation Street, which had the name of Kelleher before they changed it to honor Queen Victoria. And there is Ryan Street running down into Redfern, and Brophy Street, mean and horrible, flowing into Elizabeth Street, which leads to the city.
This is a frontways view of Bunyip Bluegum and his uncle Wattleberry. At a glance you can see what a fine, round, splendid fellow Bunyip Bluegum is, without me telling you. At a second glance you can see that the uncle is more square than round, and that his face has whiskers on it. Looked at sideways you can still see what a splendid fellow Bunyip is, though you can only see one of his uncle's whiskers. Observed from behind, however, you completely lose sight of the whiskers, and so fail to realize how immensely important they are. In fact, these very whiskers were the chief cause of Bunyip's leaving home to see the world, for, as he often said to himself, whiskers alone are bad enough, attached to faces coarse and rough. But how much greater their offense is when stuck on uncles' countenances. The plain truth was that Bunyip and his uncle lived in a small house in a tree, and there was no room for the whiskers. What was worse, the whiskers were red, and they blew about in the wind, and Uncle Wattleberry would insist on bringing them to the dinner table with him, where they got in the soup. Bunyip Bluegum was a tidy bear, and he objected to whisker soup, so he was forced to eat his meals outside, which was awkward, and besides, lizards came and borrowed his soup. His uncle refused to listen to reason on the subject of his whiskers. It was quite useless giving him hints, such as presents of razors, and scissors, and boxes of matches to burn them off. On such occasions he would remark,
All the June Saturday afternoon Sam Pollitt's children were on the lookout for him as they skated round the dirt sidewalks and seamed old asphalt of our street and Reservoir Road that bounded the deep-grassed acres of Tahoga House, their home. They were not usually allowed to run helter-skelter about the streets, but Sam was out late with the naturalists looking for lizards and salamanders round the Potomac Bluffs. Henrietta, their mother, was in town. Bonnie, their youthful aunt and general servant, had her afternoon off, and they were being minded by Louisa, their half-sister, 11.5 years old, the eldest of their brood. Strict and anxious when their parents were at home, Louisa when left in sole command was benevolent, liking to hear their shouts from a distance while she lay on her belly, reading, at the top of the orchard, or ambled, wool-gathering, about the house. The sun dropped between reefs of cloud into the Virginia woods, a rain frog rattled, and the air grew damp. Mother, coming home from the Wisconsin Avenue car, with parcels, was seen from various corners by the perspiring young ones, who rushed to meet her, churring on their skates, and who convoyed her home, doing figures round her, weaving and blowing about her or holding to her skirt, and Mary, in spite of her decorous irritations,
Why at the beginning of things is there always light? Dorigo Evans' earliest memories were of sun flooding a church hall in which he sat with his mother and grandmother. A wooden church hall. Blinding light and him toddling back and forth, in and out of its transcendent welcome, into the arms of women. Women who loved him. Like entering the sea and returning to the beach. Over and over. Bless you, his mother says as she holds him and lets him go. Bless you, boy. That must have been 1915 or 1916. He would have been 1 or 2. Shadows came later in the form of a forearm rising up, its black outline leaping in the greasy light of a kerosene lantern. Jackie McGuire was sitting in the Evans' small dark kitchen, crying. No one cried then, except babies. Jackie McGuire was an old man, maybe 40, perhaps older, and he was trying to brush the tears away from his pockmarked face with the back of his hand. Or was it with his fingers? Only his crying was fixed in Dorigo Evans' memory. It was a sound like something breaking. Its slowing rhythm reminded him of a rabbit's hind legs thumping the ground as it is strangled by a snare, the only sound he had ever heard that was similar.
This is what happened. My Zulu nanny was a person made for laughter, warmth and softness, and before my life started properly she would clasp me to her breasts and stroke my golden curls with a hand so large it seemed to contain my whole head. My hurts were soothed with a song about a brave young warrior hunting a lion and a women's song about doing the washing down on the rock beside the river where, at sunset, the baboons would come out of the hills to drink. My life proper started at the age of 5 when my mother had her nervous breakdown. I was torn from my black nanny with her big white smile and taken from my grandfather's farm and sent to boarding school. Then began a time of yellow wedges of pumpkin burned black and bitter at the edges, mashed potato with glassy lumps, meat aproned with gristle and gray gravy, diced carrots, warm, wet, flatulent cabbage, beds that wet themselves in the morning, and an entirely new sensation called loneliness. I was the youngest child in the school by 2 years and spoke only English while the other children spoke Afrikaans, the language of the Boers, which was the name for the Dutch settlers in South Africa. They called the English settlers Ruineks, which means redneck, because in the Boer War, which had happened 40 years before between the English and the Dutch settlers, the pale-skinned English troopers got very sunburned and their necks turned bright red.
With the north wind hard at his back, Scully stood in the doorway and sniffed. The cold breeze charged into the house, finding every recess and shadowy hollow. It rattled boards upstairs and lifted scabs of paint from the walls to come back full in his face, smelling of mildew, turf, soot, bird's hit, Worcestershire sauce and the sealed-up scent of the dead and forgotten. He scraped his muddy boots on the flagstones and closed the door behind him. The sudden noise caused an explosion in the chimney. His jackdaws fled their fortress of twigs in the fireplace. His heart racing, he listened to them batter skyward, out into the failing day, and when they were gone he lit a match and set it amongst the debris. In a moment fire roared like a mob in tile hearth and gave off a sudden, shifting light. The walls were green streaked, the beams overhead swathed in webs and the floor swimming with trash, but he was comforted by the new sound and light in the place, something present besides his own breathing. He simply stood there fire-struck like the farm boy of his youth, watching the flames consume half-fossilized leaves and twigs and cones. There in the blaze he saw the huge burns of memory, the windrows of uprooted Karas whose sparks went up like flares for days on end over the new cleared land. The walls here were a dance now, and chunks of burning soot tumbled out onto the hearthstone. Scully jigged about, kicking them back, light-headed with the stench and the thought of the new life coming to him.
The Alexander, with its cargo of convicts, had bucked over the face of the ocean for the better part of a year. Now it had fetched up at the end of the earth. There was no lock on the door of the hut where William Thornhill, transported for the term of his natural life in the year of our Lord 1806, was passing his first night in His Majesty's penal colony of New South Wales. There was hardly a door, barely a wall, only a flap of bark, a screen of sticks and mud. There was no need of lock, of door, of wall. This was a prison whose bars were 10,000 miles of water. Thornhill's wife was sleeping sweet and peaceful against him, her hands still entwined in his. The child and the baby were asleep too, curled up together. Only Thornhill could not bring himself to close his eyes on this foreign darkness. Through the doorway of the hut he could feel the night, huge and damp, flowing in and bringing with it the sounds of its own life, tickings and creakings, small private rustlings, and beyond that the soughing of the forest, mile after mile.
Hector! His eyes still shut, a dream dissolving and already impossible to recall, Hector's hand sluggishly reached across the bed. Good. Aish was up. He let out a victorious fart, burying his face deep into the pillow to escape the clammy methane stink. I don't want to sleep in a boys' locker room, Aisha would always complain on the rare, inadvertent moments when he forgot himself in front of her. Through the years he had learned to rein his body in, to allow himself to only let go in solitude, farting and pissing in the shower, burping alone in the car, not washing or brushing his teeth all weekend when she was away at conferences. It was not that his wife was a prude, she just seemed to barely tolerate the smells and expressions of the male body. He himself would have no problem falling asleep in a girl's locker room, surrounded by the moist, heady fragrance of sweet young cunt. Afloat, still half entrapped in sleep's tender clutch, he twisted onto his back and shifted the sheet off his body. Sweet young cunt. He'd spoken out loud.